In December 2025, the U.S. government built a new national defense system, and it's not one that uses radar or, steel or missiles.
Right. It's built entirely out of procurement rules,
Mhm.
supply chain definitions, lines of code, that sort of thing.
Exactly. So today we are doing a deep dive into the actual mechanics of the BIOSECURE Act, which, if you were tracking the headlines, was tucked inside the fiscal year 2026 National Defense Authorization Act.
Yeah, the NDAA, which usually gets a lot of attention, but this specific piece is, well, it's massive.
It totally is. And, it was originally framed as this big geopolitical boxing match, like just a push to ban 5 specific Chinese biotechnology companies.
Right, that was the headline everybody saw.
Yeah, but the
Okay.
legislation that actually crossed the finish line, it did something far more permanent. I mean, it didn't just publish a list of names. It engineered this entire legal machine for governance.
A machine is a really good way to describe it, because we are looking at a fundamental rewiring of how democratic institutions approach, well, the intersection of biology, national security, and global supply chains.
And for you listening, whether you're managing supply chains, analyzing tech policy, or, I don't know, operating in the medical sector, understanding the plumbing of this act is critical.
Absolutely. Because our mission today is to impartially dismantle that machine. We're not here to take a political side. We really just need to examine how this legislation identifies threats
Right.
and the mechanisms it uses to enforce its boundaries.
Right, because governments are trying to regulate threats that haven't even really materialized yet.
Yeah, which is incredibly hard to do. The geopolitical debates are super loud, obviously, but the actual structural changes to procurement law, that's what will quietly reshape the whole industry.
So to grasp how this machine actually operates, I think we have to look at the architectural failure of the original proposal.
Oh, definitely. The first drafts were, they were incredibly blunt.
Yeah. They just named 5 specific Chinese biotechnology firms, major entities like BGI and WuXi AppTec, and basically said, federal agencies, you cannot do business with them, period.
Right, which is what we call signature-based governance. It attempts to regulate corporate identity rather than corporate behavior.
And what's the problem with that? I mean, it sounds straightforward.
Well, the fatal flaw with signature-based governance in a complex global market is just how quickly it becomes obsolete.
Because they can just change their names.
Exactly. The moment a named company establishes a new subsidiary or undergoes some corporate restructuring or simply rebrands, the law loses its teeth.
It's just a piece of paper at that point.
Right. And then Congress would have to pass an entirely new piece of legislation just to add the new name to the list. It's wildly inefficient.
It's basically playing whack-a-mole. And, it's the exact same trap the cybersecurity industry fell into like 20 years ago with early antivirus software.
Oh, that's a great analogy. How so?
Well, those old programs, they relied on known malware signatures. So it was this static database of bad files, like a bouncer at a club holding a list of 5 names.
Right. And if you aren't on the list, you get in.
Exactly. So if a hacker tweaked literally a single line of code, the signature changed. The malware slips right past the filter. They essentially just put on a fake mustache and walked right in.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
So modern cybersecurity had to evolve toward heuristic behavioral threat detection. It looks for programs that are trying to do sketchy things, like access parts of the operating system they shouldn't, regardless of what the file is named.
And that is exactly the philosophy the final version of the BIOSECURE Act adopted. It completely dropped the 5-company list.
So they built a behavioral filter instead.
Exactly. The legislation builds institutional capacity to capture entities based on patterns of risk. Because, the threat surface in biotechnology is evolving daily. Yeah. And the law requires a mechanism that can mutate at that exact same speed. By shifting the focus from static corporate identities to specific high-risk activities, the system can basically flag new entities organically.
Okay, but establishing a behavioral filter in international trade law, that sounds like a nightmare. You can't just tell federal agencies, hey, avoid the bad guys.
No, definitely not. You need a rigorous, legally defensible mechanism to actually process and categorize these companies.
Which brings us to the actual filtering mechanism, because the law constructs 2 entirely distinct pathways to designate an entity as a biotechnology company of concern.
Right. It isn't just one monolithic process. There's a dual-track system.
So let's start with track 1, the fast lane.
Yeah, track 1 actually bypasses the behavioral assessment entirely. It leans on an existing framework. Specifically, the Department of Defense's Section 1260H list.
Okay, wait, what is that list exactly?
It's the DoD's list of identified Chinese military companies. If a company's already on that list and they touch biotech equipment or services, they are instantly designated under this new act.
Instantly, like no warning.
Instantly. It functions as a strict liability standard. There's no prior notice, no designated comment period, no administrative appeal process before the prohibition kicks in.
Wow.
Yeah, the designation is just automatic by operation of law.
Okay, I see the logic, but I have to push back a little on the principle here.
Go for it.
If we are creating this automatic track that bans companies based on a pre-existing DoD list with zero procedural review, aren't we basically just reintroducing the old static blacklist through the back door?
That's a really fair point.
I mean, we literally just spent the first segment talking about how static lists fail. How does Track 1 square with this whole adaptive blueprint concept?
Well, that tension is actually one of the most heavily analyzed aspects of the whole legislation. The justification lies in the temporal profiling of risk.
Temporal profiling, meaning like the speed of the threat?
Exactly. Track 1 is very narrowly tailored. It's for entities the government has already assessed as immediate military-linked actors. When you're dealing with known military integration, the system prioritizes velocity over deliberation.
Okay, so if the house is on fire, you don't form a committee to study the water pressure. You just grab the hose.
Right. You just act. But Track 2, that's the actual behavioral net. This is the deliberate track.
And who administers that one?
It's administered by the Office of Management and Budget, or the OMB. And this pathway targets complex commercial entities that might lack direct military ties, but they're controlled by foreign adversaries and exhibit very specific risk profiles.
And the behaviors that trigger this OMB track are highly specific, right?
Yeah.
The law specifically highlights companies handling multi-omic data without express informed consent.
Yes. Or companies that maintain affiliations with foreign adversary intelligence services. But that first point, multi-omic data, that is the crucial term there.
It sounds intensely sci-fi. What does it actually cover?
It encompasses human genomic data, protein mapping, basically the raw biological blueprints of entire populations.
Which is terrifying if it falls into the wrong hands. But because the OMB track is targeting civilian commercial supply chains, the law suddenly cares very deeply about due process.
Oh, extremely. The procedural protections here are extensive. An entity flagged under the OMB track gets 90 days to respond to a proposed designation.
So they can actually fight it.
Yeah. And there are mandates for periodic reviews, and the initial designations remain non-public until they are completely finalized.
So it really is a dual-speed transmission. You have velocity for the immediate military threats and deliberation for the commercial risks.
Exactly, and shows a really high level of systemic awareness, taking immediate, blunt action against deeply integrated commercial suppliers without any due process. That could trigger catastrophic disruptions in civilian markets.
Right, which leads us perfectly to the actual ripple effect of this thing. Because identifying the targets is just, well, it's merely the diagnostic phase.
Right, that's just finding the problem.
The real shockwave comes from how the law enforces these designations downstream. Because the prohibitions aren't just limited to, say, the Pentagon buying a centrifuge directly from a flagged company.
No, it goes so much further than that. The text restricts executive agencies from contracting with any entity that uses covered biotech equipment or services in the performance of their federal work.
And this is where the compliance burden just completely explodes across the domestic economy.
It's massive. Think about an independent American research university. Let's say they win a federal grant.
Okay.
If even one of their laboratories utilizes a genetic sequencer manufactured by a designated company to conduct that federally funded research, that university is caught in the legislative net.
Wow. So they could lose their funding just for having the wrong machine in the building.
Yep. And the definition of biotech equipment and services is sweeping. It covers instruments, biological analysis services, disease detection.
But the critical inclusion, and I think this is the piece that truly modernizes the law, is the explicit targeting of software and firmware running those machines.
Oh, absolutely. We aren't just talking about the physical hardware of a gene sequencer anymore.
Right, because a modern genomic sequencer is essentially like an advanced edge computing device. It maps biological reality into these massive data sets of digital reality.
And that's where the vulnerability really lies. If the firmware, like the fundamental code operating the hardware, is compromised by an adversary, the integrity of the biological data is completely compromised.
Because the firmware could be engineered to, what, subtly exfiltrate genomic profiles back to foreign servers?
Yes, or even imperceptibly alter the analysis results. By embedding software and firmware into the definition of covered equipment, the legislation officially recognizes a huge reality.
Which is?
That biological supply chain risks are inextricably linked to digital vulnerabilities. You can't secure the biology without securing the code.
That is fascinating. But, okay, so the downstream net is vast, right? But it does hit a hard structural boundary.
It does. It's not infinite.
The prohibitions apply exclusively to federal procurement, federal grants, and federal loans. So the massive commercial market sits just completely outside the blast radius.
Right. The law only goes so far.
And I was looking at this, like, 91% of the American pharmaceutical market relies on generic drugs flowing through civilian hospitals and retail pharmacies. The federal government represents only a fraction of that total purchasing power.
It's true. It's a huge market.
It's like building a state-of-the-art security door for the front of your house, but leaving the massive patio door wide open. If you look at the global supply of active pharmaceutical ingredients, or APIs, there are hundreds of critical generic components where a single foreign nation acts as the sole supplier.
Yeah, and that's exactly why they left the patio door open, to use your analogy. Banning sole-source foreign APIs in the commercial market, that would immediately induce critical drug shortages.
Right, people wouldn't be able to get their meds.
Exactly. It would effectively shift a supply chain vulnerability into an immediate public health crisis. The jurisdictional boundary of this law is highly calculated.
So the federal limitation acts as a sort of levee.
Yes, a levee is the perfect word. The government is attempting to secure its own biological data and supply lines, but without deliberately collapsing the broader civilian healthcare infrastructure.
And the clearest evidence of that calculated boundary is the specific carve-out for the Medicaid drug rebate program, right?
Oh, the Medicaid safe harbor, yes.
The law features this safe harbor to ensure drug manufacturers aren't penalized within the massive Medicaid system if they suddenly cannot meet their master agreements with the Veterans Affairs Department due to these new security prohibitions.
Right. They built a pressure valve into the legislation specifically because they know how fragile these dependencies are.
They know the system would break without it.
Exactly. The Medicaid safe harbor proves that the drafters mapped out the secondary and tertiary consequences of decoupling. You cannot simply sever ties with deeply entrenched global suppliers without introducing catastrophic systemic shocks.
So the legislation operates with a scalpel, basically.
Because the underlying economic dependencies demand it. They had no other choice.
Which brings us to the ultimate friction point of this whole deep dive, time.
Yes.
The timeline.
Because the safe harbors and jurisdictional boundaries pad the impact geographically, but the law also pads the impact chronologically. The actual enforcement timeline is incredibly delayed.
Very delayed. I mean, the NDAA passed in December 2025, but the OMB was given a full year simply to formulate its initial criteria-based list of designated companies.
Just to make the list.
Just to make the list. And then following the publication of that list, the massive machinery of the Federal Acquisition Regulation, or the FAR, has to be formally updated.
And the FAR is essentially the operating system for all federal spending, right?
Exactly. Every single contracting officer in the government relies on its clauses. And the prohibitions only take effect 60 days after the FIR update for companies on the fast-track 1260H list.
And 90 days after for entities designated through the OMB process.
Right.
But wait, layered on top of all that bureaucratic timeline is a massive grandfather clause. Yes, the 5-year rule. The legislation establishes a 5-year rule protecting legacy agreements and previously negotiated options from invalidation.
Okay, so let's do the math on that. When you aggregate the OMB drafting period, the FIR revisions, and that 5-year legacy protection, comprehensive enforcement across the federal landscape might not fully bite until, 2028? Or even later?
2028 or later is a very realistic estimate, which creates a really unique temporal gap.
What are companies doing right now, then?
Right now, private companies are operating in this intense preparatory phase. They're mapping their supply chains down to the micro-component level.
They're doing their own work.
Exactly. They're conducting provenance audits on the firmware operating their laboratory hardware. And crucially, they're auditing their own corporate governance structures and joint ventures just to ensure they don't accidentally trigger an automatic designation under that military fast track.
That makes sense. But this temporal gap exposes what I think is the core structural dilemma of the legislation, what we can call the tempo problem.
The tempo problem. Unpack that a bit.
Well, the BIOSECURE Act engineers this massive, legally mandated demand pull for domestic and allied biotechnology. Like, the federal government is legally required to transition its supply chain,
Right.
but there is absolutely no corresponding supply push. The domestic continuous manufacturing facilities, they don't exist at scale. The trained workforce to staff those hypothetical facilities hasn't been scaled up.
No, it really hasn't.
It's literally the equivalent of the government canceling all their orders from the biggest catering company in town, giving you a massive contract to feed thousands of people, but you haven't even poured the concrete for your kitchen yet.
That is exactly what is happening. And that highlights the economic vulnerability of this implementation delay.
Because it's not just bureaucratic lag.
No, the years between the enactment of the law and its full enforcement represent a high-stakes strategic window. During this multi-year gap, foreign biotechnology producers are not standing still.
They're probably working harder than ever.
Absolutely. They are continually optimizing their manufacturing processes, advancing their genomic sequencing technology, and ruthlessly driving down their costs.
They're riding down the efficiency learning curve while domestic suppliers are essentially still waiting for building permits.
Which is a huge problem.
Yeah.
Because if the U.S. and its allies fail to heavily subsidize and construct alternative biotechnology infrastructure during this 5-year grace period, the law will completely backfire.
Wait, how does it backfire? Just by being expensive?
Worse, it will transform from a national security shield into a massive engine for compliance friction.
Because nobody can actually buy the stuff they need.
Exactly. If alternative secure suppliers do not exist at scale when the prohibitions finally take full effect around 2028, federal agencies will be paralyzed. They will be forced into a perpetual cycle of requesting waivers and legal exemptions simply because there is no one else capable of fulfilling the contracts.
Wow. So a statutory procurement mandate without the corresponding domestic industrial capacity is, well, it's fundamentally an illusion of security.
It turns a security measure into an inflation engine. The ultimate race isn't actually between the text of the U.S. law and the designated foreign companies.
Then what is the real race?
The real race is between the law's delayed implementation timeline and the physical construction timeline of the domestic manufacturing base. The BIOSECURE Act provides the regulatory architecture, but on its own it is incomplete.
It's just the blueprint.
Yes. It operates as one instrument in a broader strategy that requires immense capital allocation, physical infrastructure development, and deep allied partnerships to actually activate successfully.
Well, let's pull the threads of this deep dive together, because this has been fascinating. We tracked how the BIOSECURE Act abandoned the fragile, signature-based model of static blacklists in favor of a behavioral adaptive machine.
Right, moving from names to behaviors.
Yep. And then we examined the dual-speed transmission of its enforcement, the strict liability velocity of the DoD fast track versus the deliberate due process of the OMB track.
We also explored how the law treats biological risk as digital risk by targeting firmware.
Which is such a wild concept. And at the same time, they built that jurisdictional levy to protect the civilian commercial pharmaceutical market.
The open patio door.
Exactly. Finally, we unpack the temporal gap, highlighting the urgent race to build domestic capacity before the legal hammer actually drops in 2028.
The legislative engineering here is remarkable, but I think the implications extend far beyond genomic sequencers and pharmaceutical active ingredients.
Where else do you see this going?
Well, the fundamental test is whether this framework of adaptive governance will serve as the blueprint for how democratic institutions attempt to regulate all frontier technologies.
Like what? AI?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Consider artificial intelligence, quantum computing, or autonomous robotics. In these fields, the threat surface evolves daily, just like biotech.
So the same rules apply.
Exactly. The ultimate question isn't whether we can accurately identify the specific technological danger present today. The real question is whether our historically slow, deliberative legal systems can finally learn to mutate and adapt as rapidly as the technologies they're trying to constrain.
Wow. It all comes down to the architecture of the plumbing. Are we designing systems that frantically patch yesterday's leaks, or are we engineering a framework capable of dynamically routing around tomorrow's pressure spikes?
That's the billion-dollar question.
It really is. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep examining the hidden structures driving the news. Keep questioning the mechanics of the world around you. And we will catch you on the next one.